Good afternoon, and welcome to the sixth in our series of Fireside Chats, fueled by Holland and produced by Plastics News. I'm Plastics News Conference Director Joe Pryweller. We are proud to bring you this streaming event where you'll hear live, casual conversations with leading experts in the plastics industry. As a side note, this is the last Fireside Chat in our continuing series for 2017. You can view all 6 of these discussions at the Plastics News website under the Events tab. Today we are broadcasting this event live via YouTube from Plastics News offices in Detroit, and you will have the opportunity to ask questions in real time and receive on-air responses. To participate in this live chat, you must have a Google account with an associated YouTube channel. If you do not have a Google account, you can either create one or add a YouTube channel to an existing account. You can type questions in the live chat box to the right of your screen at any time during the chat. You can also text questions on the dedicated Fireside Chat number, which is 248-929-5194. Today's chat will explore disruptors, new opportunities, and technology-driven advancements in medical device development from the perspective of both materials and molding, geared for early adopters and what they need to know. Our presenters tell us that the future of plastics in healthcare is now. With us today for this chat are Josh Blackmore, Global Healthcare Manager for the Holland Company, and Ben Bouchard, Vice President of International Business Development and Managing Director China for GW Plastics. Such topics as miniaturization and drug delivery, point-of-care diagnostics, medical packaging, and more are on the docket to discuss. Both speakers have vast experience in the industry. Josh with both large medical molders and materials companies, and Ben as a longtime executive at GW Plastics, with global insights from working on expansions in Mexico and China. Allow me now to turn the conversation over to Josh Blackmore of the Holland Company. As a reminder, you can also type questions in the chat box or text them to the dedicated Fireside Chat number, 248-929-5194. Josh, take it away.
Thanks, Joe. Well, we're here today to talk about disruptive technology and trends that are in the medical device industry. And it's one thing for people to come to you and say, this is a trend and we can agree on that. But what Ben and I wanted to talk to you today about was not only what is the trend, but as molders or materials people or OEMs in the industry, how can we take advantage of these trends? So the first thing that we're going to talk about is in the drug delivery space. And we're talking about the miniaturization of drug delivery devices and some of the changes that are being pushed down into the devices, some of the changes in the ways devices are being asked to do new and different things. And I know you have a perspective on that. But I was just interested from a GW perspective, with this, do you see the miniaturization? Do you agree? And how are you taking advantage of this trend?
I think the miniaturization is not just in the drug delivery device. It really goes into a broad scope of the medical field.
Sure.
Everyone wants to have their parts and their products do more with less real estate,
right,
less geometry, etc. And it's really driving an increasing complexity of the parts. It's driving increased difficulty in the geometry, different material selections,
yes,
and a lot of things trying to get more and more function and attributes out of a smaller geometry and in many cases a much more complex part.
Sure. And we're seeing it from our side where you've got injection pens or maybe patch pumps that are new. They're being asked to communicate with wireless devices, and they're being asked to have sound, maybe to even speak commands out or track patient usage and things like that. So when we look at things like materials and how can we take advantage of these new demands, these new trends, we're looking at having materials do more inside the design. I'll give you 2 examples. One is something called laser direct structuring, where you can actually take a laser and print on the chassis or the housing an electrical pathway that would be equivalent to, say, copper wire, and eliminate the wiring that's required. This would enable battery power to get just about anywhere and not take up any space at all. Likewise, we're seeing lasers be used for laser welding so you can get hermetic seals. So if people are going to wear this and maybe take a bath or a shower, this gives them new lifestyle choices. And I know you're taking some of these complexities and you're making them a reality. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what are you doing, just taking advantage of that trend and to make that a reality for your customers.
Well, the challenge becomes how to use the geometry of the part to the advantage. So you end up, instead of having just a simple cover, a decorative cover to cover the mechanics, now as the product gets smaller, that cover needs to also be functional. There needs to be functional bracketry to it. There might be the things you're speaking of with some of the laser etching for electrical conductivity. And so the part geometry drives a lot more demands on the part. So if you're looking, for example, a very visual surface where you want to minimize the backside disruptions of the part from a design perspective, you don't want to have any sink marks or any wall sections, that luxury is no longer available. Now you really need to be able to have a cosmetic surface, but then also have that geometry, that functional geometry behind it. That creates a couple of challenges. First of all, in the tooling. How do you construct this tooling to have a uniform part performance and appearance, and then also in the processing. On the tooling side, some of the newer technologies that we're seeing is 3D printing of cavity steel.
Of steel. Tool steel. Okay.
Which allows conformal cooling channels, so that rather than just have straight rifle drilled cooling lines, you can have the cooling lines conform to the shape of the part. And this allows you to have the ability to put cooling exactly where you need it in the part, regardless of, regardless of anything in the tool geometry. But also you can then reduce the temperature profile across the surface of the mold and the surface of the part. You can get rid of residual stresses or reduce residual stresses. You can get a better surface finish or a more controlled surface finish, and it gives you a lot more flexibility to have the tool adapt to that difficult part geometry.
Interesting.
On the processing side, you can use scientific mold basis for the initial process development to make sure that the process is the most robust available. And then secondly, use that same technology for process monitoring. So you use a robust tool, a robust process, and then you monitor that process in production to make sure that regardless of the complexity of the part and the challenge of the geometry, you still end up with a very consistent and high quality part, shot to shot and part to part.
Yeah, I could see how that could bring some advantages. It kind of leads me into the next topic, though. We were talking about diagnostics and in vitro diagnostics. There's a big trend right now that the diagnostics are moving inside the doctor's office. And we're seeing it be called point of care or point of care testing, point of care diagnostics, where you can go in and provide a sample, a specimen, and get answers as to what's going on right there in the doctor's office.
We're also seeing some of that same technology apply to the fact that now, instead of having a test device or a disposable test rack or test platform, really be set up for a lab environment where somebody is not necessarily concerned about the aesthetics of the equipment or the footprint of the equipment, or even in some cases ease of use, because it's a trained technician using it repetitively.
Right.
Now as you get into point of care, the product requirements oftentimes are for a smaller footprint. A doctor's office has got more limited real estate. The aesthetics become a little bit more important because you want to have a device that the doctor is, in some cases, showcasing his technology to patients, having that capability in-house. And then the aesthetics of the test itself and the clarity of the purpose of the different sub-devices needs to be more clear, so that when the test is done on a less frequent basis, it can still be done consistently.
Right. From a material standpoint, I kind of like this trend, because while you still you need all the high polish of something that would go out of an institution into an office or even into a home, because point of care takes place in the home. But on the inside, the test sophistication is such that it's really putting pressure on new materials. So from a material standpoint, I'm seeing some of the diagnostics need surface tension as a feature. So something that might be hydrophobic or water repelling, or something that might conduct water, which would be more hydrophilic. And depending on the tests and the sophistication of what the fluid path or the microfluidics of the test mechanism itself, then we can start looking at unique, new, different, higher complexity of materials as you start building these tests. The situation I run into, and maybe you agree, is that you can't afford to have like thousands and thousands or millions of tests being run and tolerate errors. Even one error could result in a misdiagnosis, which could cascade into all kinds of different situations. So from a quality standpoint, that's got to be putting some pressure back, traceability-wise and quality-wise back on your system.
Well, I think that the quality expectations, the quality requirements just continue to become more and more demanding. And the quality really starts with the design. And the design starts even before the material selection. And getting involved earlier and earlier with knowledgeable contributors on both the raw material and then the tooling and the processing side early can really help address quality from the real root cause basis.
Right.
Okay. And that's been an important attribute with a lot of our successful customers, is finding the right manufacturing partners and getting them involved early.
Right.
Are you finding more high volume disposable tests driving some changes too, and causing you to have to do something with less cost, I guess, involved with it too for these in vitro diagnostic tests?
Yeah, the high volume is of course everyone goes for the high volume. It's really great, but the high volume also drives more and more cost reduction, which then involves generally higher capital investment, whether it's in the tooling, the manufacturing equipment, assembly automation, etc. So everybody has to step up and make the appropriate investments to get that resulting low-cost disposable product.
And we see if we can get together with the molder, the designer, and the materials, we can get those three people in a room, which sounds super simple, and it just doesn't always happen. There are so many decisions that can be made better at that juncture because you've got everybody who's got a stake in it. So it makes it just that much more important.
Well, a lot of the secondary attributes that you talk about with the raw materials can sometimes be impacted positively or negatively by the processing.
Right. Exactly. So in this case, if you want to make an intensely complex device that has high reliability, that material selection is critical, putting money where you need it, taking it out where you don't. But you have to have that whole process all the way integrated back so that if something is in error, we find it, we trace it, we track it, we can go right down to the cavity or the process that's going on.
Every attribute of the supply chain has to add value. So rather than just having the lowest cost material, the lowest cost tooling, the lowest cost molding, all of those steps have to add value to the product, whether it be in the quality, whether it be in the attributes, etc. So we're finding fewer and fewer parts that are just a garden variety vanilla material. Right. More and more of them have got some of the attributes you've talked about, whether it's the laser conductivity, whether it's the antibacterial, UV stability, colorability, laser marking for UDI, all of those secondary capabilities. And then on the tooling, if you don't have a reliable tool, regardless of what the cost of that tool is, it's a waste. It creates waste in the process. It creates scrap. It creates quality issues. It creates issues that can be very expensive down the road. So you need to make sure that the investment in the tooling is appropriate and it brings to bear the appropriate technology that's available to get the best product in the most reliable manner.
Right.
And then you layer that with a processor that can apply that technology to make sure that the material attributes carry forward, that the tooling is utilized and is maintained consistently, and then the product is monitored, the process is monitored, so that you really have the culmination of all of those value streams into a reliable and consistent product.
Which, when we start talking about these high volume things like in vitro diagnostics, it starts making me think about some of the device packaging or the pharmaceutical pill packaging or packaging in general. This has been an industry that's been long cost reduced. It's been long at optimizing just about everything. But even today, we're starting to see some new trends inside medical packaging. Things like custom blow forming, which is a new method for making pill bottles that would yield thinner walls, it would yield more consistent walls, and quicker cycle times. These taken together would, can make as much as a 20% cost out. But in order to get there, the thinner walls, you'd need better raw materials, better plastics that would have an improved performance on moisture vapor transmission rates and better strength for the torque of the neck when you twist the cap on or off. And so we're starting now, even in the high volume packaging area, to see trends that processors are going to have an opportunity to take advantage. There are new materials stepping up to the challenge for less moisture transmission. And I know you get involved too. I don't think it was custom blow form that you got involved, but you got involved in some packaging as well. Can you tell us a little bit how that goes?
Well, our customers are really asking for a full service products offering. So we get involved from the initial product design, and we can offer that design assistance, whether it's design for function in some cases, but clearly on a design for manufacturability, part commonization, minimize the number of parts. We talked about adding attributes to parts with two-shot, with silicone integration, et cetera,
Right.
to be able to integrate as many different part functions into the fewest number of components. And then it gets into the assembly, whether it's a manual operation, a automated operation, or some hybrid between them, and then ultimately into the packaging, which is what you're referring to. So in some cases it's it's a plastic bag with a seal and a label. In other cases it's consumer packaging, because even if it's a prescription device, a lot of times it's got a consumer packaging with IFU and general instructions, or a form-fit seal tray. If it's a surgical device, for example, where the finished assembled device is going into a vacuum form tray that is custom to the geometry of the part. It has a Tyvek type seal to it that is then sent out for secondary sterilization before going onto the customer.
Are you seeing the UDI, or the unique device identification, on the package, which is clear, or are you seeing it on the device, which you can scan through the clear package?
We're seeing both. Actually, we're seeing it on the device itself, either with a label, with a laser mark, okay, which is challenging from a material perspective.
Sure.
We're seeing it on the exterior package. In some cases, we're allowed to have it in the packaging itself. It's a single-use device, for example. And in some cases, it is things where it's on the device, but it has to be scannable through a clear window of some type.
There are new FDA regulations in 2017 for that. How is that going to affect you, both of you, within this area for UDI?
You want to start?
Well, it's interesting because they started with implants, the class 3 implants. Then it went to class 2s. Now they're at class 1. So virtually everything now has to have a unique device identification. From a material standpoint, it's pushing us to have more and more laser engravable materials, but more and more laser engravable materials that are also passing biocompatibility. All these trends here, they're somewhat disruptive, or great opportunities for materials, but people have to stay on top of what's changed in the device, and how do you answer that? Because the answer isn't always put a sticker on it. And sometimes that's not the most effective or cost-effective way to do that.
Right. Yeah, the laser, the intent is to have something that is identifiable on the part at the point of manufacture, right? So that you want to have it linear with the point of manufacture. You're not trying to marry a secondary sticker or something later on in the feed chain if possible. So laser marking is very important, but there are some attributes to that make it difficult. The barcode or the UDI has to be both machine readable as well as eye readable. It has to be a number that you can manually read, and so you need to have some very fine, pixelation to that to meet both of those requirements.
Right.
So it's something that the industry is still adapting to as well. We're finding, some cases a sticker is just the best way to do it. It's an existing product, an existing assembly line. It's going to be difficult to make a material change for a laser etch or something. But new products is becoming a much more integral part of the design from the very beginning. And it's important. And then the follow-on to that is now you've got a huge amount of data, okay? And that data needs to be consistent, reliable, backed up, etc. And so choosing your manufacturing partner is important because, you know, as a device company, whether it's a large OEM or whatever, you need to be able to depend on the person who has that data to be able to back it up if the phone call comes.
Sure. How do you reckon that with the need for standardization and low cost, where you mentioned a different mix of products that you have now too that you're looking at in packaging,
Right.
medical packaging. Right. How do you maintain consistency, universality for a part, maybe even globally for some of this, and adding the UDI label to that also?
Yeah, I mean, it adds another level of complexity. You know, at this point, there's no automatic pat answer on exactly how to apply the UDI, but the regulations are very stringent and very clear. There's not a lot of wiggle room on it. So you have to have a system. You have to work with your customer to figure out what is the best solution for that particular product and where it is in its life cycle. You know, if it's a product that is mature, if it's a product that has a material that isn't going to be well suited for laser marking, if it's difficult because of regulatory reasons to qualify a new material, you know, then you might go with a sticker or something. But again, you have to be careful because that sticker adds another level of correlation that you have to, you know, to make sure is in line with your product. It isn't just a matter of, you know, printing
Right.
a bunch of stickers and just haphazardly putting them on product.
The plastics industry essentially is adding to the safety of the overall healthcare industry from the standpoint of mistake proofing, that you have this procedure scheduled and it has a UDI on the device that's on plastic, and they can scan it and they can scan the procedure and understand the mistake proofing. But if there's an error, there's a cracked handle, that can be traced all the way back to the mold cavity itself. So the plastics industry is responding to needs to be able to improve the overall healthcare industry performance and reduce mistakes or improve errors maybe in a manufacturing technique or a cleaning technique even.
Yeah, Josh, you mentioned earlier in our discussion about you know, the barcodes, right?
Yeah.
You know, when we were talking earlier today. And you know, for a long time, you know, we've seen that with medication, right? You know, the doctor comes in, you know, they scan your patient risk code, and then they scan whatever the drug is, and they make sure that you're getting the appropriate amount of the appropriate drug, and there's a secondary computer interface on that. And it really is applying now into the devices itself, which is a different side to what I had been thinking about. You know, all our concern is on the back end, right? You know, that if something happens with the device, being able to track it back to the date of manufacture, the mold, the cavity, the shift, etc. But there's really the forward side of it as well, which is an added advantage.
Sure. You know, there's a lot of regulations that are taking place. The World Health Organization is publishing standards on cleanliness and how to disinfect things like hard surfaces. So these kinds of regulations are coming in and are being driven because there are people going into hospitals for surgical procedures or other things and coming out with a hospital-acquired infection.
Wow.
And these infections, in some cases, are not curable and they're deadly.
Oh, wow.
The rate of incidence of these is greater than some forms of cancer or car accidents. It's a very, very
major problem.
It's a big issue. So the response has been, at least for medical electronics, which are considered hard surface disinfection techniques, is that they're taking a wide variety of chemicals, whether it's glutaraldehyde or alcohols or chlorine or Clorox, many other brand names, and they're spraying the medical electronics down with a lot of these chemicals and frequently in wiping them off. So the standard product out there would be like a PC ABS that's flame retarded because it's electronic, and these, under certain chemicals, are starting to crack, craze, and then catastrophic failure. And this is huge for the OEM because their devices are failing, at least the housing of that. And so this is putting huge pressure on the plastics industry to respond with what kind of lower cost or cost-effective plastics can we have that would resist cracking and crazing from chemical disinfection. I know you work in that side too.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's compounding it is that as the medical devices get into the global market, you're finding different cleanser or cleaner families varying across different regions. Okay, so you think, okay, well, I've got these these 3 things that are used in North America. Well, that may not be the same things that are used elsewhere.
No, it is different.
How do you control for that?
Exactly, and so really getting involved in addressing the cracking and crazing, and it drives a couple different things. It drives a different philosophy in some regard on the product design, as well as from a material perspective, but also in the physical perspective, but then also in the tool design and the stress relieving in the part. So, for example, a lot of these clamshell housings on electronics used to be held together with snap fingers and things, which by design have got some residual stress built into them. Well, in a lot of cases, that residual stress compounds the cracking and crazing, the chemical attack.
Sure.
Right? And so you might want to look at a different way on the product design to minimize that residual stresses in the part when it's in place by design. The second thing is that, and I'll touch back again on conformal cooling with tooling, where with conformal cooling you can get rid of hot spots. So you think of a raw material that will shrink in the mold, right? Well, that shrinkage is not uniform. You'd love it to be uniform across the part, but there's a thermal relationship to that. And so if you have a hot spot in the mold, you can end up with a part that is dimensionally accurate, but because of the differential cooling across the part, you have a level of residual stress in the part that is invisible unless you either go through a thermal cycle or you've exposed to a chemical that can attack like a polycarbonate. So if you use a conformal cooling approach, it can minimize that thermal range across the surface of the mold and the surface of the part, bring the conformal cooling into the areas necessary that are unique to that geometry. You can end up with a part that is less susceptible to some degree to the cracking and crazing from chemical exposure, and may allow you to maintain a lower cost material in that application. There are, of course, economic solutions, right? You can go to a very expensive material to solve it, but that's not always the best advantage.
We've seen it in our own testing. We've seen where you can take like a PCABS with a zero stress part, like a dog bone, a test specimen, and you can soak it for a week, 2 weeks, in any number of the chemicals that are outlined by the World Health Organization, and pull them out and run the testing, and the physical property performance is exactly the same as when you went in. There's no degradation, no cracking, no crazing. But as soon as you put in as little as a 1% strain, you can get, let's say PCABS, we're picking on this one, but you can get this one to break with certain chemicals in 48 hours with only a drop. So the stresses become super important, and if by the design and then the design of the tool can help eliminate some stresses, then this is going to help. It doesn't matter what material you pick, it's going to help the performance of the material. But what we've seen the plastics industry respond with is saying, all right, we have a great alloy in PCABS because of the impact resistance and the drop test resistance. If we go in and put in new alloys, PET, we have better resistance to certain categories. If we alloy maybe with PBT, and maybe vary the levels of PVT versus polycarbonate to try and strike a balance between a semi-crystalline chemically resistant effect with a nice high impact polycarbonate. So you're starting to get the best of both worlds. At the end of the day, when you're looking at material selection for medical electronics, the material, the resin itself, is going to govern most of the performance against chemicals. But all of them are going to benefit from having stress relaxation or elimination, not even allowing it to form. And that would be, I would say that would be a pretty key attribute.
We're finding parallels actually in the automotive industry where fuel system components, there's all sorts of fuel additives that are causing very similar type situations where you end up with dimensional deformation of parts driven by those non-traditional chemical exposures in fuel system components. So it goes much even beyond the healthcare. That chemical compatibility even goes beyond the healthcare market.
Sure, sure.
Does design play a part of this too, besides materials for preventing against contamination with some of these?
Absolutely. I mean, it's important to know the parameters up front, right? I mean, that's part of it. Is what do you expect it to be exposed to? And from a marketing perspective, if you've got a product and you can say that it is acceptable to use these additional cleansers that are being used, you talked about the way that the hard surfaces. Well, generally that's something like a floor or a wall, a more kind of off-the-shelf cleanser. And if that same type of cleanser can be used on an electronic module or a device, it gives the hospital or the medical facility more flexibility in cleaning, as opposed to saying you have to have a special cleaner for a certain product.
Well, and the reverse is true too. If you can have a plastic material with a good design and good processing that gives you a robust product, you can go and fit in with the European disinfectants, the American disinfectants, the Asian disinfectants. You start approaching that product where it kind of leads into the next topic, which is globalization, but it leads into that point where not everything that we make in America stays in America. Oftentimes, American designs are used in Europe or in Asia, and vice versa. It could be the exact reverse. And so it kind of leads us into that topic of, how do we handle globalization? Is it real? There's onshoring, there's reshoring, there's offshoring, and then if this trend is going to continue the way it seems to be continuing, what do we look at? How are we going to take advantage of this situation to make better products, improve our market share, or
how do you standardize with some of that, I guess, too?
Well, exactly. Sure. I mean, the globalization market is interesting, it's challenging, but I think it's changed from the perspective of 10 or 15 years ago, when you say, okay, we're going to go to China or wherever the country of preference is to have low-cost labor, and we're going to take out the labor, and we're going to reduce the product cost, and it's going to be cheaper. And that drove, some moves, and there's been some pushback against that for all the appropriate reasons. But now we're seeing those markets grow where you want to be in Asia to support the Asia market. Okay? And the Asia market, and I'll just focus there for a moment, has become very, very quality conscious. Whether it's been the baby food scares or things like this, the value of quality in the Asia market is very important. And so there's a migration towards the Western brands, the established Western brands. And so you can import those products, but at some point that market in Asia grows to a point where it makes sense to manufacture in Asia for Asia, or like for like in that market. And so now you end up with a product that is the OEM's lifeblood, right? I mean, you're only as good as your product, but now you're manufacturing in multiple locations, potentially with multiple suppliers. How do you control that consistency of product, that consistency of quality? And so for us, for example, it's been very important for that standardization. We work very hard that if you walk into one of our facilities, a GW facility in China or Mexico or North America or Europe, that you have that consistent approach, whether it be the color scheme of the lobby, to the quality systems, to the measurement methodologies, to the equipment, whether it's the CMM machine or the molding machine or the secondary operation robotic equipment. And so it's really been our approach so that we can work with our global customers to present a global manufacturing footprint to match their market. What's important, though, is that we have products in the U.S., finished products, that we're shipping globally as well as to the U.S. market. We have finished products that we're shipping as a contract manufacturer for our customers in Asia that we ship high volume into Europe and high volume into the U.S. So it isn't always, one way or the other. We're seeing product in full containers, go both directions with complementary products and related products.
Right. We're seeing this similar situations. Our OEMs, the people who are making the devices, sometimes they're used to going overseas. Sometimes it's new to them. Sometimes they have a product that will intentionally go overseas. And so as you combine the complexity of the devices, the complexity of what they're going to do, and add the complexity of all the different places you want to make and or sell or distribute it, we've actually started seeing a need for us to create these regional sort of medical technical champions that will go in with a salesperson and talk to them about where do you plan on making this. Some countries we've seen, if you want access to their market, would like you to be at least assembling, if not making it, in the host country.
Really?
So there's some of this kind of pressure on there. But when it comes right back into material selection, we really need to know up front, are you going to make this here? Are you going to make this over here? And if you say, well, we're going to start here, and we don't know where we're going to go, but we're going to go because we think it's going to be successful. And so we start taking a look at all the issues that wrap around what you would call supply chain security. It would be things like, is this product available in another country? Does this product have an increased susceptibility to be discontinued? And recently with some of these hurricanes, we've had a lot of products that have gone through a force majeure where the product was, you just couldn't get it. So what we're doing is we're putting together this matrix where we work with you and we listen to what you want, physical property, fit, form, function, the typical things that plastics would do. And then we're starting to add that matrix that the OEMs are demanding and processors like GW are demanding, that they want to know, how do we minimize the risk of change in the raw materials themselves, because they're working really hard to do some standardization and be able to move and qualify and validate their process and their factories. So we're looking at a medical grade product, and I would completely recommend this for any OEM or processor, but looking at a medical grade product, which is something that's been through the biocompatibility testing, I would ask the questions, is this product available globally whether you need it or not? Because this can become important down the line whether you anticipate it or not. I would ask the next question is it made in more than one site in case something happens like a hurricane? I would ask, are we the only one? Are we the only one that's going to be in high demand for this raw material, this resin? And this way you're starting to qualify what is the level of dedication into that. So resin suppliers, some of them come in and then they leave. This is hugely disruptive. Some have been in for decades and have really built a great reputation. And so for what I look at when we want to establish what's a medical grade versus not a medical grade, it's not just whether it has biocomp testing, it's all these factors of global availability, the risk of discontinuation, risk of force majeure, these kinds of things. And so we're seeing that whether you're in America, staying in America, or you're an American and you want to go elsewhere, we want to be prepared for that.
But that's the challenge, is you've got these new capabilities within the raw material. You were talking about the laser electronic conductivity. You're talking about the the moisture flow on it. And so how do you balance bringing those new capabilities in with the raw material versus if you're the first guy, how do you confirm the material supplier is you're the right partner for them?
Wow, and it can be challenging.
How do you look at, from facility standpoint, I know you're Mexico and China and other places, as far as adding facilities and keeping the same standards you require? What challenges or opportunities are there?
Yeah, I mean, there's a great opportunity for that. I mean, I think that the quality systems and the approach, the manufacturing approach, for example, we have the exact same CMM machines and supporting software in all of our facilities. So it works very well for homologation when we're moving tools or parts.
Right.
But I think that from a customer perspective, you really have to look at what does the region represent. So in Asia, of course, generally people go for labor. But if you don't have any labor in the product, there's really not an advantage to be in Asia, right? I mean, I can mold a product less expensive. I can drop it from the molding machine less expensive in China, but by the time I ship it someplace, I've really lost that advantage. And so the advantage comes from that secondary operations if it's labor. But more and more automation is being used. Okay, so for example, Even in our China operation, we have a high level of automation for that cost competitiveness, the quality, consistency, the repeatability. But where the labor comes in is when you've got the customization. So, for example, we have products that have one core drug delivery device, but there's over 20 different variants for the packaging, whether it goes with tubing or a mouthpiece or a mask or different IFUs, different languages, and all of that is manual because it's A, difficult to automate, and B, fairly labor intensive. And so finding the right product just because it's a complex assembly doesn't necessarily mean it's labor intensive. There's a lot of opportunities with automation, particularly if you've got a supplier that has got experience with that. Going onto the tooling side, our company has tooling in 3 continents. GW Plastics has tool manufacturing in China, in North America, as well as in Europe. And each of those facilities has a different attribute or a different strength in the market. So if you've got a low volume tool, whether it's a 1 or a 4 cavity, where the labor is a higher percentage of the cost of manufacturing that tooling, it would make sense to do that in Asia in many cases. If you've got medium to high volume tooling where there's a lot of automation involved, the processes are repetitive, the U.S. tooling market has really made great strides in automation and really diminished that kind of cost differential between an Asia tool and a North America tool, and that margin, that differential, decreases as the cavitation goes up. And then our European facility is really an excellent facility for the really high ultra high cavitation, 150, 200 cavity tools, where there's a very high level of precision, a very high level of automation, and some very unique technologies that apply to that subsegment of the tooling market. So we're able, with those 3 regional tooling facilities, to really cover the broad scope of the tooling market depending on what the customer needs. It isn't always just a one-size-fits-all solution for tooling.
Right, and nothing ever starts out in 120 cavities, it seems. We always start out small, and so our focus has been on more or less standardization of having long, dedicated suppliers into the market, and then working through the brands and the grades of the different resins so that we can find the resins that will be available in those different regions, so that when we're building and specifying, where we have our design engineers, our development engineers together, we're helping them make good selections.
Tooling requirements differ per region, obviously, and that causes some changes.
Sure, it can range from commodities, like lower cost olefins or styrenics, up into engineering resins, into some of the very, very high performance areas where autoclaving and high temperature is necessary.
Sure.
Well, with materials, the cost of change is difficult, right? It's difficult to requalify a material, to reevaluate it. But some of the things that you highlighted, whether it's the stability of supply, the force majeure issues that we've had, some other instability in the marketplace, we're seeing more and more customers evaluate a second source or an alternate source for materials. And it creates a couple ripples through the supply chain. One is, regardless of the similarities on the data sheet, the materials will process oftentimes a little different. You'll end up with a little different dimensional attributes, and so you can't necessarily go,
one for one.
Yeah, 1 for 1, and so you have to be careful with that. It also doubles your dimensional qualification time, right? You're going through 2 sets of all the dimensional analysis and review. But one of the things that we've partnered with customers on is that we have a technology center, which is machines that are set up for process development with new tooling, where we can do that off of the production floor during those initial evaluation runs. It has a small metrology lab for that preliminary work. But in a case with a material supplier will come to a customer and say, we really think that you should change from your existing material to our material because of these attributes, whether it's supply chain security or other secondary attributes. And we can bring that mold into our technology center and have the material supplier processor come in with their technologist and at the press run the material the way they want it. It's adjacent to our tool shop if we need to open a gate or whatever else, and then we can do some preliminary metrology work. And so it really is a platform for us to work strongly with the material supplier to bring their customers in to evaluate a mold with all of us standing at the machine, all of us learning the exact same information, and evaluate more than one material at the same time if necessary.
Sure.
At this point, gentlemen, why don't we break for some questions from the audience and see what's out there too. One thing I was going to ask that I think it looks like somebody else did is how will 3D printing change the medical technology industry and medical device industry? We haven't really talked about 3D printing, additive manufacturing, but how's that factor into the future?
Well, two things. We have two different 3D printers. We have one that's a traditional plastic part 3D printer that helps with product visualization, marketing samples, etc. So, for example, a customer can come to us. We have a dedicated design center. They can come behind closed doors where there's some physical security as well as NDA type of security of their products. We can work with our team to design for manufacturability, improve product performance, and then run a 3D sample part for playing around the table, see what it looks like, see what it actually comes about. The secondary, and I think even more exciting technology, is we touched on the 3D tool cavity steel printing. And really that gives us some tremendous capabilities for the conformal cooling to give us conceivably up to a 30% improvement in cycle time. It's geometry dependent, but depending on the geometry, improvement in cycle time, and we're very optimistic on improvement in the process development, the tool development, the dimensional development of that tool, because that thermal profile is more consistent and more predictable. We're anticipating the ability to reduce the number of grooming loops and in tool development. This is brand new technology. We received this machine this summer, and we're going through our evaluation programs on it now.
Right.
Great. We have a question. It looks like a student at a university wants to know what someone when you enter this field should focus on. What are some areas that are important if you're just entering the field to focus on?
Sure. If they're in the plastics industry, if they're studying plastics technology, I like to tell people in our own organization that plastics is very similar from every other industry except for where it's different. And those, it's not a catch. Now bear with me. So where it's different is going through your material science, understanding fit, form, function, chemical environment, the testing requirements. This is what you do for everything. But in medical, we have a few things that are extra. So the extra things that you'd want to know, if you want to go for a job or you want to start working in the industry, the extra things are what's that vise going to touch? And how long is it going to touch it? And the example would be if it's going to touch blood, that's fine, we understand, but how long will it be in contact? It's a big difference when you go from 24 hours to 29 days to 30 days, which is a huge leap into something with higher risk. So I would start understanding, as a plastics professional, I would start understanding what happens when you need biocompatibility or body fluid contact. I would understand what type of sterilization would be necessary, because this is unique to medical. And so if you have an automotive part, you aren't necessarily going to autoclave anything. But if you're in the medical business, you'd want to know the difference between gamma sterilization, E-beam, or ethylene oxide gas sterilization, because each of these methods are going to affect the polymer in greatly or vastly different ways. And then I think when you start understanding those things, this will help you. And then there's the aspect of language in medical, which you already know, but there's approximately 5 key terms you'd want to know to be fluent in medical. You'd want to know what biocompatibility is. You'd want to know the difference between a 510K and a CE mark, right? You'd want to know sterilization. You'd want to know what the United States pharmacopoeia is versus the new ISO regulation, ISO 1099-3. So I would get up to speed on the language of medical, And then what happens to the raw material when you come in body fluid contact or sterilization technique?
Anything brief to add?
Yeah, I think a lot. I think that Josh has gone at it from a PhD in chemistry perspective.
Yeah.
I think the industry is very broad. I think that there are lots of opportunities in the plastics industry. We at GW have a very strong internship program. We have a program with local high school where we invite the high school students to come in for a credit-based program where they learn, what do we do? I mean, we all go down the roads and we see these companies on the sides of the roads, and you see the sign out front. In many cases, you don't know what's being done in there. And in many cases, like in the case of GW, there's some tremendous technology and some world-class opportunities. So I think that the industry is large enough to get involved in, from a tooling perspective, from an engineering perspective, program management. There are all sorts of inroads in the sales side, inroads into the industry. It tends to be more technical. So most of the people that I interface with in an industry have got a technical background of some degree or another, whether it's a healthcare medical technology side or engineering itself. But I think it's a very broad and growing industry.
Great. Well, here's an age-old question. If I can move on.
Sure. I was just saying I was going to like to sign up for your class.
Oh, okay.
That'd
well,
be good.
I'm sure you could. Age-old question is, how do you balance value versus cost? So I want to know about raw material costs versus the value of the product. How do you balance those two and find the right mix there?
Wow. Yeah, that's a great question. We talked about medical electronics, and you've got a material here that, because of regulations and the change in behavior in the hospital, it's putting pressure on the plastic material. So what do you want? You want to stay with a low-cost material that has the potential to break, or do you want to preserve your brand name and have something that's going to be effective at what it's going to do? Well, the range of choices that you have range from $20 a pound material, which would be great, all the way down to maybe 10, 5, 4, and into some of the commodity materials. So you start looking at what's important to you. And your brand name, having a quality device, particularly in a life-preserving situation, is paramount. So in this case, and a lot of times in medical, we're designing for something that's going to bring value where it's going to be used, and it's going to be effective, it's going to be safe, and it's going to last a long time. So that's kind of my approach when I take a look at that. And if you're going to need to go up in cost per pound, you may have a medical electronic that's tens of thousands of dollars. If you go up $1 a pound in cost of resin, this is not going to be so disruptive into that medical electronic or that device. Might be different for its disposable though.
Well, I think everyone wants to commoditize the product. Everyone wants to go price. And price is important right up until the point where you have a quality problem.
Yeah.
Right? Everyone wants to go 1 penny higher than the quality problem. Well, that's dangerous, right? You don't want to flirt with that threshold.
No.
And so, you want to have that quality. You want to have that basis. And so really that value equation to me is the quality of the product and the quality of the manufacturing.
Great. Well, let's move on from there. Another balancing act is government policy and regulations and globalization. You can look generally at what they're going to cause for property changes, I guess, anyway. But first, globalization. How's government policy going to affect globalization and
well, every government has a little different approach. Right. The China FDA is different than the US FDA, and their requirements for the differentiation between the product registration and the manufacturing registration is different than the US. They don't separate them.
Right.
So it creates some challenges in choosing the right manufacturing partner. We have customers that outsource the manufacturing of the finished product, but to supply into Asia, they need us to also supply the device registration, which is a contractual challenge. Right. So those are some of the challenges that we face on our side of the equation.
Sure. And we see this in our business too, in South America, in Brazil. There are a lot of different regulations there that would drive home content to be able to participate in the marketplace. But we also see, the Affordable Care Act is kind of what everybody talks about. And some parts of the Affordable Care Act were device taxes. And so there's this there's this feeling that if you're going to come into the American market, you're going to have to pay a device tax. If we don't have the device tax, it makes our market a more attractive place to start developing your device. So I think our government and the policies that we have do affect how innovative we can be or how early we are in the cycle. Europe could be considered a good place to start having your product versus the US, and vice versa. So I do think the policies make a big difference.
Sure. Yeah. I guess one final thing as we're running out of time. I'm curious how the regulations are balancing your property requirements too, and one of the things you're looking at is there. You mentioned innovation a little bit and affecting some of that.
Right.
Is there anything concrete of concern or that you're looking at right now that could affect positively or negatively with what you're doing with property requirements?
Regulations that are driving property requirements?
Or how do you balance some of that?
How do you balance the regulations across property requirements? The regulations are often in response to a safety concern.
Okay.
So it's just critical that the resin industry responds to those safety concerns, whether it's unique identification, whether it's chemical resistance for disinfectants, or whether it's being able to get devices that will track patient compliance. This will drive more electronics and things of this nature. So, you know, it's critical that we, as an industry, we respond to these demands, because this is what makes healthcare affordable. This is what brings it into the home. This is what makes surgery take 2 days instead of 3, or 1 day, or outpatient, which is just amazing to see all those kinds of things taking place.
Sure, bring more value to the customer in a lot of cases, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I think the regulation is, like, so for example, on the reimbursements. So you talked about patient compliance. You look at a CPAP machine, for example. You know, it's a situation where you're going out to point of care, you know, you're going to somebody's house, but there's an insurance reimbursement. So they want to make sure that the patient is actually using it. So a lot of these, you know, CPAP machines, for example, have a way to feed back. And so the doctor and the insurance provider can say, hey, wait a second, you only use this thing 5 days this month or whatever. And so, you know, that compliance, the electronics, that reporting, those are all things that are coming as an outgrowth of some of these unexpected consequences or channels to the regulation.
Sure, keeps you guys busy and working hard at new solutions and at more innovation, I guess, in what you're doing too.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a lot of cases.
Goes through the product design all the way through.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's a great field, and obviously there's a lot of complexity to it, and makes it an interesting and fun part of the plastics industry to be in, especially if you're a student looking to go into this market, right?
I would encourage it.
I would too, actually.
Excellent. Well, with that said, I want to thank today's presenters, Josh Blackmore and Ben Bouchard, for their terrific comments and for a great session. I learned a lot myself about medical plastics and devices and what's going on in the industry. There's much more to discuss in the area, obviously, but we're out of time for today, unfortunately, with some of this. We also appreciate many of the comments and the questions that we've gotten from you and your attendance at this Fireside Chat, fueled by Holland and organized and produced by Plastics News. If you want to revisit the chat, the entire event will be archived in the live stream webinar section of plasticsnews.com. Again, this chat and others in our continuing series can be found on our website. Thank you for joining us today, and we're grateful for your support of our entire series of Fireside Chats throughout the year. Look for future live events and webinars produced by our team at Plastics News. We'll see you at another event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice. You did well.
You did well, too. Thank you very much.
Joe.
Appreciate it. Well done.